The EA Sports cover athlete, guys, EA Sports came out with some information about their cover athletes. And essentially, here's what we got going on. We learned that the EA Sports NCAA Football 2025, or I think it's just called 25, football game is going to have multiple versions of the game, which means they are going to have multiple different cover athletes. They are going to have, they said, well, I don't know if it was them or some insider said it, but I read that some Matt Brown, I think it was, said it's going to be a different athlete from each power conference. As we know, there are 4 power conferences now, and it's going to be a different position for each guy, and these will be current players. We're not looking at past coaches. We're not looking at mascots or anything like that. We are looking at people who are currently playing on the teams in 2024 for NCAA Football 25. It's pretty exciting for me, especially to think about who these players are going to be. Zach, I've been racking my brain on who these players are going to be. I know you've probably been thinking about it as well. Who are some of your guesses of Big Ten players that might be on the Big Ten version cover of this game?
So I think if this were a year ago, this would have been super easy. Like it would have been maybe Marvin Harrison. Like I think Caleb Williams. Like I think those two would have been the easy picks. I think what's hard about this is the guys I'm thinking about either played second fiddle or they've transferred or like they're stars, but they're not necessarily national names. And so like a guy like Will Johnson, who I think is maybe the best corner in football, but like, I just don't know if people outside, like I know people know who he is, but like he doesn't get as much pub as a quarterback would. A lot of the guys at Ohio State and Penn State, I felt like either flew under the radar or had subpar seasons. Nick Singleton at Penn State, Emeka Ibuka, TreVeyon Henderson, like they had okay years. And then even diamonds in the rough, like I think of Kyle Monangai. Again, like I think great player, but it probably doesn't have the pub that you would think. So the guy I landed on as my top pick is Dillon Gabriel out of Oregon. And the reason is because he's well known. He's now on his 3rd team. But like it's a quarterback, it's a prominent position at a prominent program. He's probably a Heisman contender. Oregon's going to be a top 5, top 8 team in the preseason. So that it's not my favorite guess. There's a lot of other guys I might put on there, but he is the guy that I'm like, I just think with his statistics, the program pedigree, his visibility, I think that might make the most sense.
I have 2 things with that. All right. So my 2 things are, and I'm not necessarily saying you're wrong. These are just my questions I have. Number 1, is the Big Ten really going to get a quarterback when the SEC is most likely going to get Carson Beck? I can't see.
That's fair.
I can't see the SEC getting anybody else other than Carson Beck. And so I feel like that kind of has to be the selection there. I could be wrong, but that's just what I think. And then my other piece of it is, are they going to put somebody on the cover who has yet to play a snap for that team yet? You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. Is it going to look right having Dillon Gabriel in an Oregon uniform on the cover when he's taking spring game snaps, but other than that, like he's not taking a snap for him yet. Like, is it more likely to see somebody, even though maybe he's not as well known, like a Will Johnson, who has played 2 years for Michigan and been a prominent player for them, you know? So again, I'm not necessarily saying you're wrong. Those are just my questions of where my thought process goes with predicting this. Like, is that taken into account?
Yeah. And I think, I'll let the other guys chime in here in a minute. I think that's the difficulty is like, the OHIO podcast has a very, very distinct opinion here on who should be the cover athlete.
They are living up to their podcast name there. Good job.
Yeah.
For those listening on podcasts, they said my vote is for Connor Stallions and his Western Michigan attire.
That's well played, Eric. That's well played. But I think that it's hard because I have the same questions about Dillon, but it's just hard to know, okay, where are they going to go with this? Because I think there's a lot of good players, a lot of good prospects, but there's no slam dunk in the conference.
Curt, what do you think?
Yeah, Dillon Gabriel's definitely someone I wrote down two names. I wrote Dillon Gabriel, and then the other one I wrote down, which might get some pushback. I wrote Donovan Edwards for Michigan. I know he was number 2 basically last year, but that article you mentioned, JR, they want someone that's going to be on the team this year and playing this year. And I believe Donovan Edwards is now a senior for Michigan, and he's had a lot of big moments there. He had the big breakaway touchdown against Ohio State 2 years ago, I believe. And then he also went over 100 yards and had a couple touchdowns in the national championship game this past year. I think if you're NCAA relaunching the game, it makes sense to put the most recent national champion on the game. And if you're going to pick a Michigan player, I just think Donovan Edwards probably makes the most sense, just being an offensive player. And yeah, he was kind of the second fiddle to Blake Corum, but he had enough moments where I think he's still probably the most recognizable name back on the team, countrywide, that is. So I landed on Donovan Edwards as my number 1 pick for who would be on the cover.
You just had to mention that long run, didn't you, Curt?
It's just that's what came to my head of like, who is like the name right now of who's back in the Big Ten. Personally, I'd pick Darius Taylor for the Gophers. I just don't think a lot of people would agree with my biased opinion there. So
I love me some Darius Taylor. I'm going to have an outlandish pick here in just a second, but I'll let Larry go first. Larry, your thoughts?
Well, I think Curt makes a lot of sense given, Michigan standing in the national spotlight now. They're going to try to, target somebody who has national appeal, which is why, as much as I love Kyle Monunga, I think he's an absolute beast of a running back. I think he's, with the fact that he returned when he could have gone to the draft, when he had so much fanfare, had a good showing in the Pinstripe Bowl. I just don't think Rutgers is going to have that type of appeal where they're going to get a cover. So that makes sense to me. It's interesting with your Buckeyes, guys, because I kind of like controversy. I kind of like the SEC Big Ten controversy. And, if it wasn't for Henderson probably splitting the load, I might go with Judkins for the cover just because of the transfer portal and the new NIL world coming from the SEC and going to Ohio State. I think it would be interesting. It's an offensive player, but that looks like that backfield, you guys tell me, might be split. So I think it would be tough to put somebody like him up there. So, going with a Michigan player, I think might be what they do, despite some of our own personal fan favorites. But that would be my dark horse. If Judkins somehow wrestles the job away, or they want to get controversial and, hone in on what's on everybody's mind, which is this transfer portal NIL thing that's going on, SEC v Big Ten, who's the big brother in sports, could be fun.
For sure. I think, when I look at it, I feel like it has to be an offensive player. My only defensive player I think he could be is Will Johnson, right? He's one of the guys that is pretty recognizable from the sense that if you see that number 2, you see, and you know who kind of he is, especially if you're a Big Ten fan, you know who Will Johnson is. The other guy, and I think this would be so on brand for the Big Ten, right? You think about offense, you think about like, quarterbacks, you think about like, running backs. No, guys, it's the Big Ten. Let's remember tight ends. All right. Colston Loveland. I mean,
I had thought about
like,
him.
He's kind of like Donovan Edwards, like you said, Curt, but like at the end of the day, like, yeah, he doesn't have the hair. So I think that's one recognizable thing for a lot of players, but he doesn't have the hair. But like, if I'm picking a guy from the Big Ten that kind of like represents the Big Ten, and I hate saying it as a Buckeye fan, don't get me wrong, but like, if I'm really looking at this in an unbiased way, I feel like it's Colston Loveland.
I like that because it's a good cross section. It's an offensive player, but he's got the brawn. He's got the blocking ability, can catch the ball. He's a Wolverine, and they're in the spotlight right now, as we know. I kind of I could see him breaking a tackle or something on that cover.
Go one step further and put whoever I don't know off the top of my head, but put the best offensive lineman on the cover there. That's Big Ten football. Just ground.
Well, I would love that.
Or if he was back, shout out Iowa, Tory Taylor. Just an honorary hunted on the cover.
There you go.
Fantastic.
That is the specific to Kirk Ferentz cover of the NCAA football.
The OHIO podcast says, I think this one's a little bit more serious. What about Julian Fleming, former 5-star recruit, Buckeye, now Nittany Lion? I think that kind of fits in like my transfer portal idea. I don't know. What do you guys think about my transfer portal idea? The whole idea that like you probably won't take somebody who's new to a team just because like you haven't actually seen them play in their uniform. What do you think, Curt?
I just think if they did, they'd have to go quarterback probably with someone like Dillon Gabriel, who's been around a lot, who is known nationwide. Fleming's a great player. I don't know how well known he is, like outside of the Big Ten territory, but yeah, I'm kind of with you, Jared. I think if anybody, the only one they could really go with was Dillon Gabriel, but they'd probably give it to someone that gets their personal team more excited, just with someone that's been there and played there. So I'm on the same page as you.
Yeah,
you think the same thing, Larry?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it prior to you saying it, but it makes sense because this day and age, there's so much of the, they put the mock-up of the player in the jersey, the team's jersey. Guys get drafted within a half hour. The NFL, fans have them decked out in that jersey. Guys are speculating on articles and they're showing, look at him. So, but I think you're right. I think it would have to be somebody who is iconic to that team and had a full year with them last year to get up the steam, get up the media hype, the recognition, and is projected to have a big impact for the same team this year. I think you're right. I don't think they're going to go through the trouble of doing a, mock-up of somebody in a new uniform before the season even starts. So I think you're right.
My only pushback, and I agree, and I think actually the more I think about it, I think the Donovan Edwards pick is a really good one. We're in a new era of what puts the most revenue out. And I think there's a big question of, who's going to get more buzz about the game as a cover athlete. And I think Donovan Edwards actually can do that because of the big moments he's had. And this is where it's hard. I'm like, man, I don't know. Is Dillon Gabriel, and I'm not fighting for him by any means. It's just, I could see a pathway for him, even though he hasn't played a snap for Oregon, just because he's well known. But I think I agree. I just think we're in this new era of, revenue is king. And does that play into this at all?
Speaking of that too, it kind of just dawned on me in general, with the conference realignment and the fact that the Big Ten is obviously eager to promote the new coming teams who are iconic brands in and of themselves, do they go ahead and put one of the West Coast newcomers on the cover just to kind of promote the new Big Ten? You noticed when Rutgers and Maryland came in, it wasn't anything to that level, but even the commercial, the way they pushed it, I could see something like that. Although I would go with like an original, OSU, Michigan type brand, Midwestern brand. But you know how it is, like you just said, revenue is king. They might go for the marketability of the newcomers to put that foot forward and start advertising this big conference coast to coast.
Very true. Very true. Let's see. We have some people with their thoughts here. Max, Curt's co-host, says 2 Travis Hunters. One is a wide receiver, one is a cornerback. I like that. Could you imagine like Travis Hunter guarding Travis Hunter and he's like trying to knock the ball away while he's trying to catch?
That's actually not a bad idea at all.
Yeah, I like that. Louis says Dillon Gabriel easily. Again, if it's not for the Carson Beck and it's not for the like transfer thing, but Larry and Zack do make a good point there with the revenue. So who knows?
I thought the quarterback would be Quinton Ewers, to be honest, just out of Texas. I feel like he's one of the bigger names coming back, but Beck's a good one too. If they're going to just hold on for one.
That makes sense too.
I mean, we could just say Quinn Ewers for Ohio State. I mean, that was a thing a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, that's not going to fly.
Dillon, the fresh cut. Yes, it is here. I just have my Ohio State hat that I like. So it was $8.99 at Great Clips the other day. So got a sweet deal. But it was the last day of the haircuts. So yeah. All right. Let's see. OHIO podcast says, yep, I agree, Larry. Miller Moss from USC. My only thing with that is like he played in the bowl game, but that was it. Yeah, I don't know.
He did obliterate Louisville in that bowl game, though.
Yeah. And of course, we got some good trash talk in the comment here. Stay obsessed. Feels great to be national championships as an elite academic school, basically Harvard, and better. Sorry, I added that. And better human beings than OSU. Yes, going to the moral arguments now. Love it. Love it. Dillon, dog, you get cuts at Great Clips. I used to go to Sports Clips, Dillon, but then they kept talking to me as I was trying to watch sports, and I was like, if I wanted this, I would just stay at home. I wanted somebody talking to me while I'm trying to watch sports. Anyway, I love my wife. Anyway, we'll move on.